Hello, my name is Vincent Covello, and I would like to, in this segment, share with you several skills for communication purposes in high stress, high concern, risk, and crisis situations that can be used by public information officers. I've selected for the purposes of the discussion 4 particular skills that I believe are important. These are, first of all, to communicate simply and briefly. Second, to express caring and empathy. Third is to balance negatives with positives. And fourth, just to be sensitive and responsive to perceptions and concerns of stakeholders. I've selected these because these are the 4 that particularly have been researched by several hundred, research studies in the both behavioral and the social sciences. If you'd like more information about the skills that I'm describing here and more skills, there's a resource library produced by Drexel University that I strongly encourage you to take a look at. If we take the first skill, which is communicating simply and briefly, I'd like to share with you 3 templates that are particularly important in being brief and simple. The first is referred to as AGL-4. The second is referred to as the R3 template, and the third is called the 2793 template. If we take the first template, they're all part of a larger set called the KISS principles, which is to keep it simple and short. Each of these allows us to communicate in a very simple and short method and then to expand upon it when necessary. The first template that allows us to keep information simple and short is called AGL-4. It comes from research that indicates that people on average process information in risk and crisis communication situations at approximately 4 grade levels below their educational level. The average education in the United States today, according to the U.S. Census, is 10 years of education, which means if we want to keep it simple, we have to take the 10 years minus 4, which results in approximately 6th grade, which is someone who's 12 years old. This is one of the greatest challenges in risk and crisis communication, and that is to keep information at a very simple level, but not so simple that it offends the audience, but nonetheless would be easily understood by a 12-year-old. The second template that keeps us simple and short is called the Rule of 3. The Rule of 3 was first identified 2,000 years ago by Aristotle when he pointed out that individuals under high stress, high concern, and risk and crisis situations have difficulty processing information, and therefore we should keep it very simple. He talked about digestible chunks of information. He also speculated at the time, which has now been validated by research, that these chunks are best offered up in 3s. It's called the Rule of 3. 3 key messages that would be communicated 3 times with 3 supporting facts for each of those messages. The third template is the one that actually comes from neuroscience. When we looked at the issue of the Rule of 3, we found that not only did the brain stop processing information after 3 messages, but also stopped after 27 words, 9 seconds, 3 messages. In other words, there were 3 stopping rules that the brain was using to process information about risk or crisis. The first stopping rule, identified by Aristotle, was the Rule of 3, but also, on average, people stopped processing information after 27 words or 9 seconds or 3 messages, whichever came first. This particular principle actually has been widely adopted by many news media, where they will take a quote and reduce it down to 27 words, 9 seconds, and 3 messages. Therefore, if we want to be most effective in keeping it simple and short, we would present information in a 2793 format. The second major skill that we look for in public information officers is their ability to communicate empathy and caring. And the reason that's so important is because research on trust determination. Trust determination research indicates that people typically decide if someone is trustworthy within the first 9 to 30 seconds, sometimes as little as 1 second when you just simply introduce yourself. Again, this does apply to risk and crisis situations. In low stress situations, it turns out that people give you much more time by which to make that assessment. As you can see in this particular pie chart, the major determinant of trust and credibility is not competence and expertise, not honesty and openness, but it's caring empathy. As much as 50% of credibility rides on the simple determination of whether or not you're a caring, empathetic, listening human being. The next skill we look for in a public information officer is the ability to balance negatives with positives. This actually has a more recent origin. The person who first identified this as a principle was Professor Daniel Kahneman from Princeton University, the Nobel Prize winner in economics. And what Professor Kahneman indicated was that in order to balance a negative, we need at least three positives. The general principle is called loss aversion theory. On average, it takes three positives to offset a negative, actually three positives just to bring us back to zero, and a fourth necessary often to bring us into a head in the situation. This is again requires us, if we have bad news to share, that we would have at least 3 to 4 pieces of good news or constructive news as a public information officer that balance the negative. This pie chart actually indicates this asymmetry, so that's why it's sometimes referred to as the asymmetrical principle of risk and crisis communication. The fourth and final skill that we look for in a risk communicator or crisis communicator from a public information officer perspective is the ability to be sensitive and responsive to perceptions and concerns of stakeholders. The field of risk communication actually began with this type of research, looking at what drives public concerns. Why do people get worried about some things and not worried about others? The research indicates, among other things, that perception equals or becomes reality, but that what is perceived as real is real in its consequences. In that regard, researchers now for the past actually 35 years have been looking at what are the factors that influence how a person perceives a risk, which might in turn influence their acceptance of risk, their perceptions of risk, their judgments of risk, let alone, for example, outrage, which Professor Peter Sandman referred to. There's approximately 20 such factors now identified in the research. Starts off with trust, as you can see on this list. Children as victims. When children are perceived as a victim, the levels of public concern go up exponentially. When children are not involved, again, it would tend to decrease the concerns about the risk. The second list starts off with memorable and finishes up with understood by science. The reason I share these factors is because each of these plays a critical role in influencing how a person responds to information, and therefore we want to make sure as public information officers that we're addressing these concerns in our messaging. As you see in this chart, for example, there's a relationship between the risk perception factor and the concerns that people have expressed. The worry they have, the outrage they feel. The three most important are actually the trust factor, the control factor, and the benefit factor. As you can see in this particular slide, I've broken these three different factors into three parts. When a person says whether or not they trust you or don't trust you, they're typically referring to, number one, are you listening, caring, empathetic? Number two, are you competent, expert? Number three, are you honest and open, transparent? With the most important being the caring, empathy dimension. Although I don't want to downplay at all the importance of those other dimensions, they may actually play a more important role in specific situations. The second factor that we need to address in our messaging, as well as our policies, is the benefits and fairness of the issue. There are three dimensions of benefits and fairness. People will judge benefits and fairness based on, is it individually beneficial or fair? Is it at the community level, organizational, fair and beneficial? And number three, is at the societal level. And then finally, the control issue, which is probably one of the most complex of the risk perception factors. A person feels they're in control of a situation, number one, where they have choices to be made, they're offered choices, their options, they have a voice in decision making, they have sufficient knowledge by which to make decisions, and finally, and this might strike you as the strangest of all, is things for people to do. Just giving people things to do, for example, to use insect repellent, or to drink bottled water, or to, if they see something, say something. That involves people, gives them something to do, and it tends to give people a sense of control. So again, these are the four skills that we look for in a public information officer in risk and crisis situations. The first is to communicate simply and briefly, and we have several templates that can aid us in that process. The second is to convey empathy and caring. We have a number of templates that help us in that regard, but particularly the importance of the caring empathy dimension. The third is to make sure that we balance our messages, our negative messages or the bad news, with free, positive, or constructive messages. And finally, we make sure that we're sensitive to the various concerns that people have as driven by risk perception factors, and therefore we use those factors in developing our message set. So again, I want to thank you very much for joining me in this segment.